لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم. My brothers and sisters, friends, guests, I want to welcome you to this week's edition of A Conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. This week's conversation, alhamdulillah, is going to be another thought-provoking exchange on one of those hot-button issues. Our focus will be on the political challenges confronting Muslims in North America. From electoral politics to the Black Lives Matter related uprisings, to such socio-cultural political challenges as the abortion-related right to choose debates and LGBTQ. Our guests for the conversation will be Jameel Aalim Johnson and our returning guest, Imam Yusuf Rios. Brother Jameel is a brother I have known for many years. He is one of the politically engaged pillars of the Muslim community in the Washington, D.C. area. He has been president of Prince George's County Muslim Council since its founding in 2008. The mission of this organization, the Prince George's County Muslim Council, is to involve the Muslim community in the civic and political affairs of the country. Of the community in the in civic and political affairs of the county of Prince George's County. He is a former chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Prince George's Muslim Association, or PGMA as it's known, and a former chair of PGMA's Board of Education. Jameel has extensive experience in the political arena, having served 10 years as chief of staff for U.S. Congressman Gregory Meeks, and previously as a community liaison for former Congressman Floyd H. Flake. So this brother has a lot of experience, a lot of insight that he's garnered over the years under his belt. He was a founding member and first president of the Congressional Muslim Staffers Association, as well as the former president of the Bipartisan House Chiefs of Staff Association. Professionally, he is associate vice president in the Government Relations Office for a New York-based fintech company. He holds an MBA in International Finance from St. John's University and a bachelor's in economics from the University of Virginia. He lives with his wife and 3 children in Lanham, Maryland, one of the DC suburbs. Imam Yusuf Rios, Jose Yusuf Rios, again a returning guest, is the resident scholar of the Islamic Learning Foundation. ILF is the Education in Tarbiyah project of the Islamic Circle of North America. It seeks to provide a holistic approach to Islamic personality development through mentorship and didactics. Sheikh Yusuf was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to a devout Christian family. In his late teens, his goal was to become a Catholic monk. He later joined the Capuchin Franciscans program at Borromeo Seminary in Wickliffe, Ohio, where he studied for 2.5 years in preparation to become a priest. During his studies at Borromeo Seminary, he studied Catholic and Western philosophy and theology. It is during this period in his life, in his early 20s, that he discovered the path to Islam. He joined the Muslim community in Cleveland, Ohio, and began studying Islam for a number of years. His passion for learning Islam led him to join the student body at Islamic American University in Detroit, where he received his foundation in the Arabic and Islamic sciences. He later traveled to Cairo, Egypt, where he continued his pursuit of Islamic knowledge for many years. Imam Yusuf has a bachelor's in Western philosophy and sociology from John Carroll University and is working on a master's in Islamic sciences at the Islamic University of Minnesota. He has served as an instructor with Islamic American University, Al-Huda University, Guidance College, and the Saalakhan Institute. He is also a founding member of the 3 Puerto Rican Imams Project for Relief and Support of those who suffered in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And it pleases me to also be able to reiterate the fact that this is a Salam media-based broadcast out of South Africa. So we have an international audience for this very thought-provoking conversation that we're about to have. I'm about to do something else that I haven't done before. Given the nature of this conversation, and I hope this is going to be a nice test to see how it goes. We're going to, I'm going to Facebook Live this as well from my little device here. And because again, this is a very, very, very important topic. And I'm looking forward, my brother, to getting into this, the political challenges confronting Muslims in North America. This is the kind of discussion that we need to have throughout the country, especially in these very challenging times. So I'm going to begin by welcoming both of you. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
My brother Jameel Aalim Johnson. Let's begin with you, Akeem. Why is it necessary, in your view, or is it even necessary, in your opinion, for Muslims to be involved in the political process here in the United States? Is it necessary? And if so, why?
To Brother Mauri, Brother Yusuf, and all those who may be listening. I hope that what I speak of could be of some benefit to the audience. I have grown up personally in the political arena, and I used to actually shun it. It was really something that my mother was very involved with. I myself had very little interest in politics, very little concern for politicians. But as I grew up and went to college, I began to see, particularly in my neighborhood, how elected officials were often coming to the Black community for votes, but anytime they had resources to distribute, it went to other communities. And I realized that even when they came to the Black communities for votes, the votes were very little. It was really just enough to put them over someone else. When Jesse Jackson ran for president in '84, I got involved in voter registration. I saw how, and I'm saying this all in relation to your question, not into my own history, but I saw how much we shunned being involved as a people. So of course we were being ignored. Now, this is before I took Shahada.
Mm-hmm.
I did have an opportunity as I was studying Islam to work for an elected official, to work for Congressman Flake. And that's when I began to realize the workings of the political system and how some people, particularly the Muslim community, was often being used as cannon fodder in order to gin up the votes of other people and the support of other people. And that we had very little response. But of course, I heard from certain people that astaghfirullah, democracy is haram, we shouldn't be involved in this kufa system. It's not until we have Sharia that we should get involved. But I'm looking at it, and I talked to a brother who had studied some overseas, like Brother Yusuf, for a while. And one thing that he said was, Allah has not left us bereft of aid. And so I began to, even I was still working in the system and became a chief of staff, I began looking at it from a knowledge point of view and learning from, I am not one of the ulama, I do not have that level of knowledge. I am what I would consider, Joe Muslim when it comes to that.
Yes.
But alhamdulillah, I had the communications to get information about what many of the scholars will be getting to say about the involvement of Muslims who live in non-Muslim societies in voting and politics. And the thing that they pointed out was it is a Sharia concept that you're always trying to get to the better situation. And you have to use the tools that are available to you to get to that situation. So for instance, one of the translated quotes that was sent to me by one of the scholars was that if you have two people running, and he says both of them are Christian, he said one of them is going to win. Isn't it better to get the one, to support the one who will do either the most good or the least harm to the Muslims? Because whether you vote or don't vote, someone's still going to end up in office. It's not as if you say, well, we're going to withhold our votes so that person has no jurisdiction over us. That is not reality.
Right.
The reality is you're going to have two people. So when one stands up and says, I will support the right of the Muslims to worship. Matter of fact, I will even consider having them in my administration, versus another one who says, I think I should block all Muslims from entering this country. I think that Islam hates us and that these people are terrorists and so on and so forth. That actually makes your choice easier for you. And as one of the ulama said, who happened to be when he was in the United States at that time, who's from the United States, someone asked him a question at a function that we had. And he said, matter of fact, in the state of Maryland, we were dealing with two issues at that time that were going to be on the referendum. And one of them was the issue was you should have gambling in Prince George's County. And Mauri, you probably remember this. And whether or not Prince George's County the state of Maryland actually, should allow homosexual marriage, what they called marriage equality. Mm-hmm. So one of the people in the audience asked, when the scholar explained to them the issue of who's better for the Muslims, especially if you have someone who can negotiate with them, he said, so the person in the audience asked, he said, well, what if they support gambling and LGBT marriage? And the scholar responded, he said, well, beyond that, what if they believe that Allah is one in a Trinity? Mm-hmm. And we know the issue of saying that Allah has partners. There is no worse sin in Islam, right? Mm-hmm. But the point being is you're still going to have one of them elected. So if they both support these same issues, still, who's better for you and who's worse for you? Because you're going to get one, like it or not. You're not going to get the ideal one at this point in time, but you're going to get one. So try to make that change. In addition, I've always believed that we as Muslims, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us, you are the best community for mankind. So how can you not get involved in the civic and political arena and try to make change for the better? How do you not bring the community that you live in that which you have to offer, which was revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his messenger? The messenger taught us about being the good neighbor, about the responsibilities of our neighbors, to the point where even one of the companions mentioned how he used to talk about the rights of the neighbors so much that we thought that they might have the right to inherit from us. So being involved in this civic arena is also a part of saying, how do I help to make my neighborhood better and make it better for my community? Because I'm living there. My family is living there. My brothers and sisters are living there, and also make it better for my neighbors who have certain rights over me.
Now, before I put the same question and get for lack of a better description, a Muslim scholar's response to that same challenging question, I want to ask you, Brother Jameel, how long in total have you been yourself involved in politics in the U.S.? My sense is from what you've shared. I knew about your relationship with Gregory Meeks. In fact, I think that's when we met, back when you were chief of staff for Congressman Meeks. I didn't know about the Flake connection, and it sounds like you started out with Flake. Did you start out with him, and then you went to Meeks, to Meeks's office, and what was the total amount of time that you've been involved?
Well, I guess if you take a look at it, I registered to vote when I turned 18.
Okay.
Right. The first time I really got involved was about 2 years later. That was 1984. So that gives you my age timeline. 1984, when Jesse Jackson ran for president.
Okay.
I think that was the first year I voted. Then in 1986, when I graduated from college, the local congressman had died a few months before, and there was a race, and Floyd Flake was one of the people in the race.
Okay.
And so I came home and I decided to work on, I listened to him and I decided to work on his campaign. And then at the end of that time period, they offered me a position. I had interviewed and they offered me a position. So I started working politically, actually as a political operative in 1987.
Okay. Alhamdulillah. And so you got quite a number of years, and you've gleaned a lot of insights over those years in how the system works. You clearly have a very clear and foundational perspective for how we as Muslims should engage it for the benefit of not only our community, but for the betterment of the community at large. And with that said, now I'd like to hear from Sheikh Yusuf on the same question. Why should, if it's your opinion that Muslims should be involved in the political process, why should they be involved? And what, and I'm sure that you're very familiar with the arguments for and against. What is your perspective on that, Sheikh Yusuf Rios?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. I was reflecting on this issue prior to coming on the show, and actually I did a live similar to it, but not with at this caliber, and in preparation for this exchange. One of the things that we have to realize, and if we don't keep this in mind, we will always fall into a dilemma with regard to our existence and our standing. In principle, because we believe in Islam, we say that our reference point is the Quran and the Sunnah. And sometimes that can be a slogan more than it is a reality.
Mm-hmm.
And so I say that to say that the Muslim community and the Muslim world, if there is such a thing, the reason why I say if there is such a thing is because that concept in and of itself is problematic. In that we say in our belief that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last of messengers. Prior to, we have a belief that we toss around almost ideologically. We say that every community has had a prophet on the earth. And so we say that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last of the prophets and messengers, the seal. What does that mean? We're claiming the universality of Islam. And if we're claiming that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is a prophet for all of humanity, which the Quran itself describes the Prophet as rahmatan lil alameen, mercy for all of humanity, just a limited translation. It could be all of the creation. I prefer all of the creation to include the environment and everything, not just the human beings and the jinn. Without getting into the technicality, we run into the problem of what does the universality of the deen mean?
Mm-hmm.
We've been kept trapped into this understanding that Islam is geographically bound to the Muslim world.
Yeah.
And so that means that by default, in practice, we're saying that Islam can only be practiced in one geographical location in the world. And we fall into a contradiction in saying that it can't be practiced in another part of the world. And that's due to scholarly debates, because the tendency of the Muslims historically, not necessarily in the time period of prophethood in and of itself, because we know that the Muslim community made hijrah to a non-Muslim land because of the qualities of justice. As a matter of fact, let's be more correct. They went to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
They left out of the Arabian Peninsula to go to the continent of Africa, if you believe in those geographical demarcations, to practice their deen. So in that consideration, there was not a geographical limitation. It was a quality of that area, right, that they were looking for in order to practice. After the fall of the Khilafah, or the Ottoman Empire, let's say the Ottoman Empire,
Mm-hmm.
with all its strengths and deficiencies, the Muslim world has struggled with their political existence and refuses to accept that there was a colonial intervention into the history of the Muslim community. Whether it's their fault or not their fault, that's all irrelevant. There's a colonial intervention. So the arguments that developed after the fall of the political system that was in place, a lot of times are not well developed. There was a group of motivated enthusiasts. They didn't know how to deal with the fact that now they lost in the war. So there's animosity towards the enemy. But now the enemy becomes from within. You have nation states that are imposed, because the Muslim world followed the European model. They followed the victor's model, ethnic-based states. So those who have this tendency and they have in their mind, well, we had our political rule, we had the Sharia dominant. Even we're not always clear on what that means, that the Sharia was dominant. Because there was injustice that exists in the Ottoman Empire as well as some justice. It wasn't just a perfect state.
Right.
So to put it short is that these arguments about not participating in the political system, sometimes they're developed in their context. So we're in between these historical arguments that have a lot to do with the fact that the Muslims lost power, and how do you deal with losing power? And the question of who does legislation belong to, and how do we understand this apparatus that we call the state? How do we navigate? And then we're dealing with Islamic teaching, which is saying that Islam is universal. If you push that forward, it took Muslims within that 100-year period, almost 100 years, to come to the conception that we have to vote. And the same Islamists that before said we have to establish a government were the same, and within that Islamist discourse, some were saying that to engage the state is unbelief. That's because they were dealing with the enemy. They were dealing with the colonial imposition. that were taking their land and forcing them into another system. So they were trying to navigate. It was all kinds of debates on that issue. Whether you had to make hijrah, how you respond. The Muslims got hit with that reality. So after some time, that same Islamic discourse, which was dealing with the political, and mind you, the Muslims were forbidden to deal with the political at the penalty of imprisonment and torture. And so the political became something that Islam is not about the political, except the power that came as it is. And then that's justified with teachings that go back in Islamic history to justify the new state. If the leader comes by the sword, then respect. All kinds of things that have come about. So the Muslim political theory has been in the working. It's in the process. It's not a given. The only thing that is a given is the principles of the deen. Not the way that people think about the deen. There's no infallibility in how people have thought about the deen. And so some have put us in a bind because they're not looking at the situation of the universality of Islam. Salihun li kulli zaman wa makan is supposed to be viable for every time and place. The Muslims in the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam were given the example of the Muslims going to Habasha, going to Africa, to a place where what is dominant is the Christian rule. What is dominant is the belief in kufr. But because there's justice there, they were sent. That's why you even have scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, statements are attributed that the state or the political orientation that practices kufr and justice can stand, and that which has belief or iman and injustice can't. So there's all kinds of thinking that are involved in that. So what has happened is that we have, I'm saying all of that to say that our thinking is still in the making. Until recently, we started talking about being involved in politics. Prior to, if you got involved in voting, it was kufr. That's the simplistic thinking that the Muslims had.
Yeah.
When Sadat was killed, let me just make this point. When Sadat was killed, those who said that they were going to establish the Sharia and they assassinated Sadat, they came with no solution. So out of that context, you get those types of statements. Whereas other Islamists that dealt with the political reality, they developed their discourses and began to see we have to see how we can deal with this situation that we're in. So then now it becomes the discourse of some of the ulama is a necessity, meaning an obligation to involve the political. How you get involved in the political becomes the point of discussion, not debate. Because the community has to talk about what are the courses of actions to engage in the political. Because you're now dealing with the fact that you're a citizen, whether you like it or not. And that citizenship is either complete or incomplete and comes with certain responsibilities and certain obligations and certain recommendations and so on and so forth. And so I think that, sorry for being long-winded, but I think that we need to look at it from that angle. Yusuf alayhi salam engaged the political. When Yusuf was taken out of his land, he engaged the political. And see, that's where the Muslims are constantly not thinking about the issue of what do you do in different contexts. They're assuming that they're living in a Muslim majority context and their situation is that which Islam should be dominant. But even in those contexts, Islam is not dominant. So we shouldn't allow those communities to speak for us in the environments that we're in. We don't speak for them in their situations, but what we do is stand for them when injustice is there. We're the ones that stand for them. We're the ones that exercise our civil liberties to protect their human rights. But when it comes to us existing, they tell us, no, don't exercise your civil liberties because you're going against the deen. And you see the contradiction.
Yeah, there's a definite contradiction there. And, that brings me, it's interesting. You reference Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, and there are two quotes, and I wish I had one of them with me. I mean, one is very specific to the holding of offices and the argument that Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah made. In fact, I'm going to, when this program is complete and we send it out for folks, I'm going to include in the description that observation, a direct quote from Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah in translation, where he this hardliner, this brother, this scholar who was known to be one of the hardliners of the Muslim era, you know, he spoke to the relevance of Muslims holding office, a righteous person holding office, the merits versus the demerits of someone who is not a fit person holding office. I'm going to make sure that we include that quote, but there's another quote that of Taymiyyah's that I have memorized because I reference it often in much of my the work that I do as a human rights advocate, where he says civilization is based on justice and the consequences of oppression are devastating. Therefore, it is said Allah aids the just state even if it is non-Muslim, and withholds his help from the oppressive state even if it is Muslim. And that to me is a ringing lesson for us, those of us who live in predominantly non-Muslim populated states, that there is value. There is beyond value, there is a responsibility for citizens of conscience wherever they are to help their country live up to the better part of itself. Because if we don't, you know, in the same way that there is a price that is paid by individuals who engage in corruption, who engage in oppression, there is also a cost for nations that engage in the same. Now, Brother Jameel, on this issue of, you know, where we are today in the here and now, in the opinion of many, even members of his own party, the occupant of the Oval Office right now is considered to be the worst in the lifetimes of many folk who have weighed in on this question. I've heard so many folk share the opinion that this is the worst president of my lifetime. And I've even heard some Republicans make this observation. Mm-hmm. Whether you agree or don't agree with that perspective, what is an undeniable fact is that we are in very, very challenging times. The combination of the coronavirus pandemic and the impact that it has had on America and other nation states around the world, coupled with where we are right now in terms of the spotlight, not just a national spotlight, but an international spotlight being on America's criminal justice system, with heavy emphasis on policing and how policing has been done in this country. We have seen something that is unprecedented. Certainly in my lifetime, I've never seen anything like this, where you've had the width and breadth and consistency of demonstrations, north, south, east, and west in this country, as we're seeing today, and the effect that these demonstrations have had on folk in other nations. There have been demonstrations in solidarity to what's going on here in America, in Europe, and in Africa, and in Asia. I've never seen anything like this before. I mean, we are at one of those potential tipping point moments. When I had Sheikh Abdullah Hakim Quick on for a conversation a few weeks ago, he referred to this as an opportunity, this moment that we are in as a nation, as an opportunity for a reset. Mm-hmm. With that being said, Brother Jameel, there is a tremendous amount of debate going on right now about the nature of these demonstrations and whether or not Muslims should participate. Now, the vast majority of the opinion within the Muslim street, which is demonstrated by the young Muslims that are out in the street, and some older Muslims, I've attended a couple of demonstrations myself, is that, you know, we should be there. We should be there. We have an obligation to be a part of this movement that's taking place. But there are others. There are others who are arguing, have been arguing, that this is no place for the Muslims to be. Muslims should not be out in the street demonstrating, that Muslims should not be engaged in protests, that and especially given the fact that this quote unquote Black Lives Matter organization has a sinister agenda connected to it, and they're taking advantage of this in order to advance that LGBTQ agenda. What are your thoughts on this, Brother Jameel? What are your thoughts on the debate? Have you heard this debate and that's been going on, and if so, what are your thoughts?
Well, let me say answer that in a few ways. One, when it comes to whether one or not should be involved in demonstrations or not demonstrations, that's a thick issue that I don't address. But I will tell you that my own sons have been to the demonstrations, and I was going to actually take my daughter, who wanted to go to one of them. My son was concerned about her going with him in case something, you know, got a little offhand, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But I could see in her the desire to do something, which is something that young people have when they see an issue of injustice. And I wanted her to understand that I supported that desire to act, because this is how I got involved. I used to do a lot more demonstrations than I do now, but I think a couple of things have to be clarified.
Yes.
The issue of demonstrations and the issue of should the Muslims be involved, those are not one and the same. A demonstration is basically a moment, and it is for the purpose of the people voicing to the media and those who may be the sources of power what their frustration and what their concerns are. But it is not the solution to the problem. It is a voicing of the problem and the desire for a solution. So, for instance, even speaking with people where I work who had this discussion amongst the Black community there, and one of the women said that she lives along what was one of the demonstration routes, and people were saying, come down out your house and join us. But she wasn't comfortable with that. And some of us are especially not comfortable now because we remember the fact that, yes, the situation is here, but there's also, as you mentioned in the beginning of early in your statement, this coronavirus has not gone away. Us being upset with the police hasn't affected this virus at all. Mm-hmm. So there are some of us, and especially, you know, myself being an older person, said it's probably not as wise for me to be a part of that, particularly at this point in time. But it doesn't mean not being involved in trying to find solutions to the problem. Because as Muslims, we have an obligation to what are we taught to do? Enjoin that which is good and forbid that which is evil. Racism is an evil. Oppression is an evil that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden even for himself. And usually the oppressor has the mindset of being superior in some way over the oppressed. The only one who is truly superior in this existence is the creator of the existence, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he has forbidden oppression for himself. So as Muslims, we have an obligation to be involved, no matter what our race and color, our ethnicity, our nationality, because we see something which is haram, and we're supposed to try to stop it with our hands if we can. If we can't do that, we ought to speak out against it. And if we are not able to do that, at the worst, we should feel bad about it in our hearts, but that is the least act of faith. So the Muslims are supposed to be involved. When it comes to the issue of Black Lives Matter, remember, Black Lives Matter is two things. It is in its origin and its reality, it is simply a statement of fact that the lives of all human beings matter, and the point being, Black lives matter too, in a country that has basically insisted since 1619 that the lives of Black people, the lives of Native Americans, the lives of Asians are not the same as the lives of white people. So acknowledging that truth, that our lives matter just as much as anybody else's, is clearly not haram. Now, there is the concern of saying, well, I'm going to get with one of those formal groups that have taken that name who has an agenda beyond that. It's not necessary to do that. But in some cases, you can simply have situations where two groups that may not normally work together are operating for the same thing, even if they're not operating together. But they may be both trying to resolve the same problem. You know, if the streets are unsafe, I'm doing what I can do, they're doing what they can do. It doesn't necessarily mean we have a formal alliance, but we both see the same problem and are trying to resolve it. You know, it's just like, for instance, if you saw a bunch of people hurt and you said, hey, man, we got to help those people. We got to get them, you know, bandages, this, that, and so on and so forth. And we got to get food and water. And they go grab some food and water. Are you not going to go grab food and water to help because, well, I don't like what that group is about? No, you're going to do what you know to be right and insist upon helping. So the Muslim Ummah needs to be involved. But the difference with us is that we do it with guidance. We do it with guidance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his messenger to try to resolve the problem. So we need to be involved, but it doesn't necessarily mean, and I leave it, like I said, I don't make decisions on fiqh issues, but, you know, whether you want to go down and you know, do a march, alhamdulillah. If you decide that's not for me, alhamdulillah too. Well, you know, I kind of stopped doing a lot of the marching in some cases because I simply saw things go on when I used to do them, even with the Muslims, that simply went out of hand because some people let their emotions get to them. And now, where they're supposed to be doing for good, they do harm to other people who have not done them harm because their emotions are ginned up at this demonstration. And after seeing that a few times, I said, well, you know what? That's not the way I'm going to go about it anymore. But I don't say to other people, you can't go about it that way. And I think there's one thing that we have to consider. And I was listening, you know, very carefully to Brother Yusuf because I love the historical perspective and the political, the worldwide political perspective that we get, even from Islam, particularly since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, is that there are some places that will say to you, sometimes you have to wonder certain things that have filtered into Islamic teachings that are really somebody else's political reality. And so they come and tell you, you shouldn't do this as a Muslim because they don't want Muslims where they are doing it. And they're not taking into consideration the circumstances that you're in. One of the statements I once heard from one of the ulama at a Harvard Islamic Finance Conference, someone in the audience asked a question about political giving. and whether or not it's like, the point is it like bribery to someone who's running, or is it more like a donation to someone? And he said, could one of the scholars answer? So the moderator, I was on the panel at that time, the moderator turned and said, Brother Jameel, do you want to answer that? And I said, no. He said, can one of the scholars answer it? There was only one in the room who was still in the time, because the scholars panel had been the previous panel. So when they turned to the scholar to ask him, now the scholar was from, there were like 3 or 4 scholars in the panel. I think he was from the Far East. His response was, you need to ask somebody who's from here. Yes. And I always thought that was one of the wisest things I've ever heard him say, because he didn't take it upon himself, not knowing the American political system, to give a fatwa on what's right and wrong. He hadn't studied it. He may have studied the deen, but he hadn't studied this system and how best to apply it. So instead of just giving any answer, he said, you need to ask somebody who's from here, who understands the system. So I'm kind of hesitant on some of the things that people have said over the years about political involvement, demonstrations, and so on and so forth, because the question is, what situation and circumstance are they applying it to?
Alhamdulillah. You know, Sheikh Yusuf, in a number of your Facebook live presentations over the past few weeks, you've emphasized that point. You know, the importance of Muslims in America not looking overseas for answers to some of the challenging issues that we are faced with here within our American context. Go ahead and give your own perspective on the question and raised, and what our brother Jameel had to say, the perspective that he shared.
I want to embellish on what our brother Jameel said, and I want to extend it out a little bit. And I know sometimes in these forums, you know, we don't get to really clarify all of our thinking. But there's something that he said about understanding the system, which applies to the issue of what he was saying about protesting and so on and so forth. There's 2 things: is understanding minhaj al-taghyir, or the methodology of change. How do you bring about change when you talk about enjoining the good and forbidding the evil? But not only that, we have a characteristic of the ummah that yad'una ila al-khayr, that we call to the good before commanding to the good and the evil. We call to it before commanding, right? And joining in. And so that's another characteristic that we fail to look at. Like, what type of work are we doing to, you know, to basically call people to the good in the society before we're saying that we're enjoining the good and forbidding the evil? We're not calling people or educating them in the way of prophethood. So we're not creating that environment where we create that space where the values of revelation are known. Forget about us. Forget about saying our values, but the values of revelation, because it's really about the revelation. We're just a means to communicate the values of revelation in terms of our task and our identity. One of the issues that comes up is that there's not just protests going on. There's rallies going on. There's actions going on. And so a lot of times, you know, before we come to a judgment, الحكم فرع عن التصور, before we can come to a judgment, we have to conceptualize the issue. That's the principle in scholarship. People are not conceptualizing the issue properly. And I have said this to a number of imams. Have you been out there, you as a leader? Or are you talking from what you're seeing on the internet? Okay, if you're from what you're seeing on the internet, are you doing your research solidly? Because part of the issue that people are using is a logic which becomes fuzzy. There's a conspiracy, there's an agenda. We're falling into an agenda. Like, we're not agents that are active and capable of also directing the flow of things. That's part of strategy. You know, you take and you seize the opportunity, right? Whether it's in business or war, whatever, you also seize opportunities when they come. So first we have to understand, you know, what's going on out there. We have to understand what's going on out there. There's a lot of political actions that are there. You know, there's a lot of different strategies that are being used, and there's a lot of people that are out there. There's Congress representatives that don't agree with the system. There's professionals, there's teachers, there's believers, there's unbelievers. So this is a movement that has gone beyond LGBT, it's gone beyond BLM. Where do you stand in calling to the good? Not just to say that you're just going with the flow. So that's the part of the problem that, you know, we also ourselves as a community, we live in a bubble. So we're not even talking about this thing in the right way. There's so much that's going on. There's actions, there's petitions, there's dialogues with local government. You know, there's dialogue with the union itself is in a dialogue.
That's right.
With the police union. We're even in a dialogue where theorists are saying, well, can the police be considered workers? So the labor movement is involved. There's a number of different people that are involved in this. So we have to characterize it properly. And then we have to say, what are the different strategies that are we going to use to talk about bringing about change or enjoying the good in a situation where we have to say, because we don't like to say, Black folk are being killed, Muslims. Where do you stand on Black folk being killed? Are you just saying that our only position is just to talk about LGBT? When I just proved in a discourse, I can construct and say that there's more going on than just LGBT. There's more than this, just that agenda. There's a restructuring of capital. There's a defunding effort that's talking about the shifting of funds to other places in services and in government except just policing. There's a discussion on the nature and the structure of the society. So they're just focusing on the issue of sexual orientation and identity, and they're not looking at the other issues that are going on. And so we it's hard to come to a judgment with a community that wants to only talk about things with one set of issues. And then also a community that's painting itself as non-actors in historical reality. It's just passive people that are being acted upon. This group is acting upon us and we have to defend ourselves. Whereas the Sharia, the values of it say that there's an aspect of the objectives of the deen which are conservative. But there's another aspect which is progressive. Meaning, what are you? It's not just about preserving your values. What are you doing actively to ensure that there's growth and cultivation and you're sharing your values? In other words, يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ. How are you calling the people to the good? Where's that presence? لِتَكُونْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ. Right? يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ. You have to have a presence. Where's your presence? Where's your representation on the ground so people have an understanding in your contribution to society? So I think that the way that we talk about these things is not properly characterized. We're letting talking heads come in. We're not scientific. Where's the political science? Where's the sociology? We're talking about hidden agendas. The LGBT community has no hidden agenda. I had a conversation like this with brothers recently. I said, what country do you live in? Because they were saying the hidden agenda. I said, look, there's federal protected status for the LGBT. That's in law. That you weren't in the discussions 20 years ago when there was a discussion on civil unions and the nature of the family. There's no hidden agenda. The Black Lives Matters movement from the LGBT side, they openly are telling you some of the things that they're about, but in action, they're telling you that they're about more things than just that. You understand what I'm saying? But the Muslims are saying that we're pro-society, pro-goodness, pro-justice, but then in our actions, we're showing that all we care about is a judgment on the LGBT community. And we have been saying for a long time that we don't care about Black lives because of the way that we have been dealing with the African-American community and its existence as a Muslim community and in general as its existence as a people. What have we done to support the African-American community? As a matter of fact, we have sidelined the African-American community, the Muslim community. The discourse in America politically from the Muslim side has nothing to do with the situations and conditions and concerns of the African-American community. We've actually have moved it for a long time to just be about foreign policy or Islamophobia, which, and I mentioned this before, which ISPU as a Muslim think tank wrote an article to influence the political process. And in that was a mention of Islamophobia, and there was a discussion in that paper that Muslims would not unite on the issue of racism, but they would unite on the issue of Islamophobia. So they used the language of the civil rights movement, which came from the African American community, to construct a discourse on Islamophobia, which eliminated the discourse on racism, and to just deal with religious discrimination, which deals with only a certain class of Muslims. Because, you know, indigenous folk are not worried about what people's opinions are. They were not worried about it during the time of Muhammad Ali. They were not worried about it afterwards. As a matter of fact, indigenous folk went and pushed the system to change from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, changing legislation. We know that some communities have even changed zoning laws. Masjid Bilal in Cleveland, they changed the zoning law so that the masjid can face the Qibla. So it has come out of, the community has come out of struggle and influence. But what has happened is there is an accommodationist philosophy in part of the Muslim community. And so now as a Muslim community, Islamic movement is saying, hold up, we went the wrong way. Now we have to have a discussion about our role and our place in the society and in the political process and our objectives. We cannot just only be focused on the concerns of the Muslim world, because we have to be focused on our existence and our continuity. So then how do we achieve change for ourselves? We can't just be focused on protecting our rights. We have to be full participants in the society to exercise sovereignty through our citizenship and also share Islam. I don't want to be long-winded on the issue, but we're a work in progress. Mm-hmm. Our political philosophy for the American or Western context is deficient. It's deficient on analysis. It's deficient in understanding ourselves. Matter of fact, we didn't talk about being the good citizen till after 9/11. Most of the, prior to that, our psychology was outside of the American context, with the exception probably of the Ward of Dean community. We didn't see ourselves as part of this society. And our scholarship told us we were not part of this society. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of documentation to that. So we have to understand what's going on the ground, what is put before us as far as theories of change. You know, and I had this discussion with Imam Malik Mujahid. And we know Imam Malik Mujahid's Sound Vision from Sound Vision. We know his influence on the system, how he has participated politically for a long time. And he's a Pakistani brother of origin. And how he has contributed to the change of healthcare law in the Illinois area, which impacts all of the community. How he has pushed for the Rohingya and so on and so forth. And yes, we have had that conversation that there is no real solid understanding of how to influence the system in much of the Muslim community. They're not active. So if they're not active and involved, how can they be speaking? And this discussion is taking place within ICNA right now as well. The necessity of having a discourse and a set of actions which talk about how do we deal with this context. MAS tried to do that for a while, but Mehdi Bray was on the forefront of that, an African-American leader, and it kind of just dissipated. So we have not really invested in it properly. Now we only have a discourse of Islamophobia. CARE is renewing itself and saying, well, you know what? Yes, we've been a one-issue people, like the Catholics are a one-issue people. They only deal with abortion and forget about social justice, rights of the poor, whatever. But the Muslims have only focused on Islamophobia. So now that the African-American community is existence is under threat, not just from police brutality, but from the prison system, from poverty, from a number of different issues. Now that is the discussion, now we want to get into the discourse on propriety and halal haram of being involved in sexuality, this and that. Like if the African-American community doesn't exist and we're being told to say, oh, let's think about this from the angle of a LGBT agenda. You know, so then how do we come to the issue of enjoining the good and forbidding the evil in the case of the African-American community? Are we telling the African-American community, suffer your brutality, your bumps? And we could say the same thing for the Latino community. You know, following the same problem. Right now, we have 2 Latinos that were murdered at Fort Hood, the base. Yeah. And so, you know, and a lot of other issues. There was a young boy that was shot like 20-something times. So where is our due process before law? Yeah. The system is supposed to be a system of due process. So there's a lot to be said, but we have to as organizations, as a community, we have to really talk about what it is that we're doing and how we're going to approach this, because our conversations are not right.
We are at the end of the program, and I'm going to invite both of you to share some final thoughts. And you can take your final thoughts wherever you want to take them. But before you do, I want to add just a little bit of food for thought on this Black Lives Matter LGBTQ controversy debate that has been, unfortunately, I consider it unfortunate, raging in certain quarters of the Muslim community as a result of what we've been seeing in the streets. My own perspective is that, all of humanity is divided basically into two types of people: good people and bad people. And you find good people and bad people among all stripes of folk. One of the arguments I've been making is that Black Lives Matter, the principle, the movement, is much bigger than the organization that now carries this name. It's much bigger, it's much older, it goes all the way back to the roots of African American struggle. Black Lives Matter. And this term, I mean, I've even heard the term used, the expression used in many years past. With that being said, as it pertains to the organization, despite the fact that one or two of its principal founders are gay, are members of the LGBTQ community, from my perspective, that doesn't make any difference at all. It makes no difference. But as members of that community, in a country like the United States of America, which is a secular society, they have as much right to advocate for their interests as any other human beings within this part of the world, within this country. They have as much right. And I could be wrong, but my read of some of this controversy coming from some quarters is that, some of our brothers are jealous of the influence. Are jealous of the influence that some of these folk who belong to that community, the LGBTQ community, have been able to generate, the kind of influence that they have been able to generate as a result of the work that they have put in for what they consider to be their priority. And what we should be doing is seeing this as a positive challenge to put in that same kind of work for what we consider to be our priorities. But getting back to the point of the Black Lives Matter organization, and I am not a part of the order. I'm not a card-carrying member of the organization, but I respect what this organization has done. I support much of what this organization has done. Most of what this organization has done, I am down with it. I am supportive of it. And I admire the work that's been put in. But one of the things I did when this controversy first started to rise, and I wanted to check out the backgrounds, the personal biographies of the principal founders of this organization. And they have very impressive activist backgrounds. They put in the work. Above and beyond LGBTQ issues, they put in the work on issues affecting the Black community. And that is something that should be, certainly, I respect it. Let me also say, I've referenced this in a couple of responses I've given to some of my more learned brothers. When I say learned, more learned in terms of Islamic theology. They've studied it, places like the ones that you've studied at, Imam Yusuf. I credit them with having more, knowledge of the theology and the fiqh and the other relevant issues as it pertains to the sacred knowledge pursuits of Islam. But sometimes they fall short on just practical application, in my humble opinion. But one of the things I've said to some of my brothers is that especially when they've referenced Malcolm, they reference Malcolm, I point out that there was a brilliant writer and thinker and commentator and playwright by the name of James Baldwin. That Malcolm, El-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, in his Hajj days and his post-Hajj days, in that final year of his life, he had a lot of respect for James Baldwin, and James Baldwin was openly gay. He had a lot of respect for what James Baldwin brought to the table in terms of addressing the issues that were plaguing the African American community back in the 60s. He had a lot of respect for him. And Baldwin was openly gay. There was another civil rights activist by the name of Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin was a brilliant civil rights strategist. The March on Washington of 1963 and Selma, many of the major mobilizations that took place that we hear about, that we see in the documentaries on the civil rights movement, which was just one part of the overall, African American freedom struggle, the Black Lives Matter struggle. Many of those demonstrations, the major demonstrations that have wound up in history books, this man was the strategist behind. He didn't get a lot of credit because he was gay. But he was respected for what he brought to the table. And I cite this as a way to say to my brothers and sisters, and especially my African American brothers and sisters who are Muslim and non-Muslim, we are a people with a very unique sociological experience, unlike any other people, in this country and possibly in the world. Very unique sociological experience. That our experience is one rooted in having to struggle against bigotry, having to struggle against oppression, having to struggle against state-sponsored terrorism. We should be the last people to just pursue a campaign of bigotry against others on the basis of who they are. We should be the last people. And so I personally counsel young Muslims when they, and older brothers and sisters, when they come to me for my opinion, we should maintain, and I want to be very clear on this, we must maintain our principles, our beliefs. What is right is right, what is wrong is wrong. And we maintain our beliefs and principles on these matters. But we don't use our beliefs and principles as a hammer against, other human beings because of who they are and where they are in their lives, in especially a country like America, where anything goes. And we have to, our beloved Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was a man of compassion. He was a man of justice for all. And this is what we must strive to emulate. You know, this is, for me, the most important part of his Sunnah. You know, it's far more important than the beard, far more important than the, you know, the other things that we tend to emphasize in our ritualistic approach to Islam. There are things that are far more important. And so with that said, you know, I just wanted to throw that out there as my own position on these what I consider to be fruitless debates. And in fact, I'll end on this note, my own my own point on this. I'll end on this note. You know, some of the brothers, they have a tendency to say that you know, this is the LGBTQ is the greatest threat to family life in America. It's the greatest threat to Muslim family life. And subhanAllah, that is simply not so, in my humble opinion. The greatest threat to family life for Muslims in this country is, you know, separation, divorce, not having healthy families, you know, this allowing, you know, these gulfs, generational gulfs to rise up and split, you know, the level of love and respect and compassion that we are supposed to be having within our families. These are the things that are most, you know, that are risking our families the most, in my humble opinion. And with that, I will stop, and I will begin with you, brother Jameel, and then Sheikh Yusuf. You know, just give us some closing thoughts, whatever you feel you need, what's on your heart to share on this issue of the challenges facing us today before we close out the program, inshallah ta'ala. Brother Jameel, you first.
Okay, well, I'm going to be very brief because I know we're over time, so this will take less than a minute. First and foremost, we have to remember what we were created for, which is the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
That's right.
And it is our deeds, the ritual ones, of course. We have to make our salah, we have to fast, we have to do those things as part of strengthening our iman. But the issue is, what are we doing to help our fellow human beings? What are we doing as a community to take a look at situations that are difficult? It could be healthcare, education, political empowerment, economic empowerment, whatever the case may be. What are we doing and coming together to help solve those problems? That will be the best dawah for the community at large around us. That will protect our community, and it will help us to expand outward, expand that bubble that we're in, expand it outward so it covers other people to count for us on the day of judgment. It's the only thing that matters in this life is that which counts for us on the day of judgment. And I will finish by this one read regarding the issue of, going back to your first question, of political involvement in Muslims. And this is from Sheikh Muhammad Salih al-Munajjid, who was a student of Sheikh bin Baz and Ibn Uthaymin. In a situation where there is no worthy candidate, then the vote should be given to the one who is better and more trustworthy than the other candidates. Vote should be given to the candidate that one believes will give people their rights, prevent oppression, and so on. If it is thought that a particular candidate or party will be of benefit to the general public in their day-to-day affairs, then the vote should be given to him. And by voting a particular party, it will not be considered that one agrees with all of their ideologies and beliefs. At times, voting becomes necessary. Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu narrates that the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if people see an oppressor and don't prevent him, then it's very likely that Allah will include all of them in the punishment. Therefore, and this is in the Sunnahs of Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood, therefore, if you see open oppression and transgression, and despite having the capability of preventing this oppression by giving your vote, but you don't do so, then in the light of this hadith, you will be sinful.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you, Brother Jameel.
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Correction, just because the way I was reading it up and down, I said it was Sheikh Muhammad, so that was actually what I'm reading above it. This was from Mufti Muhammad ibn Adam al-Qatarawi, Abdel Ifta, and who was a student of Mufti Taqi Usmani.
Shukran. Sheikh Yusuf, your closing thoughts, my brother.
There's a lot of issues. I think that we need to continue these types of dialogues, and we need a council of activists and scholarship that has is informed by activism to come together and work out the issues on the political front. And I made the call, and I'm making it again, to other organizations that are involved on the justice front. We need to have a conversation, whether it's Ikra, Mass, yourself, individual activists, CARE, Sound Vision, Muslim Arc, the Muslim Bailout, all of these orgs. There's some that I forgot. We need to have a discussion on social justice, but we need a council because it's being attacked.
Yes.
And we're confused on what it is. The other issue is we need a council of a small group of people, not a large group of people, that is constantly involved in these dialogues and working this stuff out. I wanted to mention a legal maxim that is mentioned by Imam Ibn Qudama from the Mughni, حفظ النفس يقدم على حفظ جزئي الدين. And that is that the preservation of life is given precedence to preserving details of Islamic practice. In my estimation, the issue of homosexuality, addressing it as haram, is a detailed issue. That doesn't mean that it's not pertinent. The family is not under attack in the Muslim community because of the LGBT, like you mentioned. Right. That's not a sound sociological analysis, because they already have a legal status. What is the problem that is causing the destruction in the Muslim family? And I'll mention for some of us is the fact that we don't have economic justice. There's a wealth gap. It has collapsed the role of the man to be able to provide on some fronts in some communities. Mm-hmm. Also, there's a lot of trauma in Muslim families. It's unhealthy emotionally. Right. What's going on. There's psychological issues. There's values issues as well. So the Muslim family, if we want to take anything from this, we have to go back and see what are the actual causes. It's not throw, ideological slogans around, and that comes from the over-perceived threat or the exaggeration. The Gallup poll says Americans exaggerate in how they look at the LGBT community. Because the LGBT community is so good and effective at organizing and putting its stuff out there, it looks massive, but it's only a certain percentage of the population. If you really have an issue with anything, we should be talking about healthy sexuality and our understanding as Muslims, mm-hmm. right? In our understanding as Muslims, we have a problem with sexuality. We have a problem with how we deal with those issues. So another thing is that we have to talk about the theory of change. We are opposing working on yourself as an individual to social change issues. You know what I'm saying? And so we're doing a bad service to Islam because we're not talking about our theory of change. It's not just about individual reformation. We're not neoliberals. We're not Christians. You know what I'm saying? We also, one of the things that I want to say that is problematic is that we have a segment of the population that's blaming the poor for their poverty. We're not Protestants. Mm-hmm. Right. You understand what I'm saying? We're not Protestants. Islam does not, Islam doesn't look at the poor in that way. It's not just the issue of lack of motivation. The question is, what are we doing to empower our people in those conditions? Right. So we have to have a theory of change. Those are the fronts that I think that we should work on. You know what I'm saying? And I think that we really need to get those fronts together really fast, because if not, we're going to be in a crisis situation. What's going to happen when the overwhelming amount of Muslims, they are unemployed, or even in the society, unemployment continues. What are we going to do in that sense? Are we just going to say, just work on your spirituality? Or are we going to demand rights? We're going to have to talk about eviction issues. We're going to have to talk about some sort of stipend coming from the government. Right. There's a lot of things. Another thing, in closing, I want to say that we should be pro community control of policing, because we are directly impacted by bad policing. So we should have a say how it is that policing takes place in our community, because our tax dollars are paying those people. Right. So we shouldn't pay people to abuse our community members.
Right.
They should uphold the law of due process. And if people say, well, more whites, are impacted, well, then the white community, I don't like using the term white, the European American community should be out there making sure that rule of law is there too. But because blacks are represented in those who are being abused along with the Latino community, I feel as though we should have an impact on understanding how this policing is affecting us and also how it is controlled. We should have a right to control our communities.
Alhamdulillah. I want to thank both of you, brothers, and also thank our brothers at Salam Media for affording us this opportunity to go over. Given the fact that we are the last show in for the in the network on Sunday, it has afforded us an opportunity to kind of go over time. And today we went way. This is the longest we've gone over in terms of the time frame, the allotted time frame. But alhamdulillah, we have this bit of a cushion because we're the last show within the network on Sundays. But for any of our brothers on that end, brothers and or sisters on the South African end that might have been inconvenienced for how long the show went today, I do humbly apologize. I hope that you consider it as having been worth it. And again, I want to thank everyone who tuned in. Those who will see this later, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to make the link available as soon as we receive it. And we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for having Muslims within our ranks able to address these kinds of challenging issues, such as Brother Jameel Aalim Johnson and Imam Yusuf Rios, the two guests that joined me today for this conversation. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless and preserve us in all of our endeavors of good. We close out with Al-Asr. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim wal Asr. Innal insana lafi kusr. Illa alladhina amanu wa amalu salihati. Wa tawassaw bil haqq. Wa tawassaw bis sabr. By the token of time, in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, by the token of time through the ages, verily humanity is in loss except those who believe and do good and exhort one another to truth and exhort one another to patiently persevere. Thank you again. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.
Good talking to you, both of you brothers.
Alhamdulillah.